The rain had stopped by dawn, but the mist hadn't lifted. It clung to the hills like a secret refusing to be told, curling around the fences and trees that lined the narrow gravel road just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. Ruth Calder stood at the edge of her porch, coffee cooling in her hand, eyes fixed on the fog as if trying to read a message in it. Her dog, Cooper, waited beside her. 6 years old, a border collie with streaks of white around his muzzle and a leather collar worn smooth from habit. He wasn't barking, he wasn't pacing, he wasn't even wagging his tail. He just stared. Ruth had come to know the difference between his stillnesses. There was the lazy afternoon stillness, the I'm too full to move stillness, the waiting for a squirrel stillness. But this one, it was something else entirely. That morning marked 3 weeks since the landslide had cut off the lower trail after a storm soaked the soil for 4 days straight. And though the earth had stopped moving, the air hadn't forgotten. Every branch drooped with dampness, every hollow held onto water. The sound of birdsong was slow to return. Ruth finished her sip and set the mug down. "Ready?" she asked, clipping the leash to Cooper's collar. He didn't respond with his usual jump or tail swish. He simply moved forward. They walked the lower trail, ignoring the warning signs posted by the county. Ruth figured the worst of the mud had dried. The creek still ran fast, swollen with runoff, but the path, what little of it remained, was walkable. As they neared the bend where the old pine had fallen last winter, Cooper stopped. Then he pulled. Not a tug, a lurch. Ruth nearly lost her footing in the wet clay. "Cooper, hey!" she barked, grabbing at the slack, but the dog was already in the ditch, muddy water up to his knees, digging. Not sniffing, not playing, digging. Ruth's first thought was, "God, please don't let it be a dead thing." She slid down the slope, grabbing at shrubs and roots, knees hitting the wet earth. Cooper's paws were caked, his nose pressed to the soil, ears twitching with urgency. He let out a low whimper, one Ruth hadn't heard since the vet's office the day her husband had passed. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. But he didn't turn. He scraped at the mud with rhythmic precision. 3 swipes, pause, 2 more. Then he froze. There was something beneath the earth, not more than 5 inches down, just beneath the surface, a clump of fur. Small, too small. Ruth's breath hitched. She reached out, fingers trembling, and brushed away the muck. A paw, tiny, soaked, then an ear, then a face. A kitten? No, not a house cat. The pattern, the ears, the jaw. Wild. She gasped, her voice caught in her throat, like it hadn't been used in years. The creature didn't move. She pressed her hand gently to its ribcage. A breath. Shallow. Barely. "Oh my God," she whispered. And then Cooper moved again. 10 feet away now, nose to the mud, barking softly in a low rhythm, like he was calling something up from the earth. Ruth cradled the tiny body to her chest. The fur was matted, cold, the limbs limp. She could feel its heartbeat, or maybe just her own pulsing through her hands. But her eyes followed Cooper, because he wasn't done. The storm hadn't buried just one, and Ruth Calder, who had already buried more than her share in life, felt the ground shift beneath her as her dog began to dig again. This was no ordinary morning walk. This was something else entirely. Ruth moved on instinct. She lowered the first kitten, no, Bobcat, onto the soft inner fold of her flannel overshirt, shielding it from the wind. Her hands were already muddy and scraped. But that didn't matter now. Cooper had found something else. He pawed urgently at the side of the ditch where runoff had carved a new crease into the hillside. Roots dangled like veins from the wall of slick clay, and something beneath them pulsed with quiet desperation. Ruth dropped to her knees, slipping on a patch of moss, her jeans soaked through immediately. "Easy, Cooper," she murmured, pushing him back gently. Her fingers reached into the earth, the cold squelch of mud pressing under her nails. She dug beside him now, shoulder to shoulder, human and dog. Then she felt it. A shape, half covered. Fur again, darker this time, heavier. She dug faster, breath ragged in her chest. A paw, then a tail, then the full weight of the second kitten fell into her palms. This one didn't stir. "No, no, come on now," she whispered, rubbing its side, checking for breath. There, faint. A shudder more than a breath. The kitten's mouth opened slightly, pulling in the cold air like it wasn't sure it wanted it. Ruth held both creatures against her, heart pounding. She didn't know how long she crouched there, wind threading through the pines above. Cooper pressed close. The world had narrowed down to her heartbeat, the damp bodies in her arms, and the dog watching her like he knew what was next. But she didn't. Her truck was a 15-minute walk back up the trail. The bobcats were small, wild, and fragile. And if she brought them home, what then? She had no formula, no gear, nothing. But the idea of leaving them here, in the ditch where they'd been discarded, or washed out, she wasn't sure, was unthinkable. Ruth looked down at the smaller kitten. Its eyes were barely slits, unfocused. The other one's ears twitched. She wrapped them tighter into her shirt and began the climb. "Come on, Coop," she said softly. He stayed ahead of her on the path, glancing back every few steps, tail low, steps measured. Normally he raced on walks, bounding like a deer across the trail. But now he moved with gravity. At the house, Ruth cleared the clutter from the kitchen counter with one arm. Mail, keys, old notebooks. Then laid the kittens on a folded blanket she'd once kept for her daughter's dog. A pink and gray patchwork flannel thing, smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. She fumbled with the phone. Her hands were shaking, fingers slippery with mud. Google search, Wild Animal Rescue, North Carolina. Scrolled. Then a number. Blue Ridge Wildlife Haven. She called. "Blue Ridge Wildlife, this is Amelia." Ruth hesitated. I found 2 bobcat kittens," she said. "They're in bad shape. I think they were buried." A pause, then, "Okay, are they warm?" "No, I'm trying. Don't feed them, no milk, nothing, just get them warm. Heating pad if you have it. Towels, layers, not direct heat." Ruth nodded, already moving. "I can bring them in." "Where are you coming from?" "Outside Weaverville, about 30 minutes out. We'll be ready. Go slow, keep them quiet. You're doing good." Ruth hung up and looked around, as if expecting the house to offer a solution. Cooper sat by the door, eyes never leaving the kittens. She found the old heating pad, the one she used after her back surgery 2 winters ago. Wrapped it in 2 towels, tucked the kittens between them like she was wrapping up something more fragile than glass. She lined a shallow box with the flannel blanket, placed them inside, and whispered, "Don't you go anywhere." Then she and Cooper drove. The rain started again halfway there, just a mist, like the sky was remembering. The drive was silent. Ruth didn't turn on the radio. She didn't need noise. Just the soft sound of breath, of hope teetering between heartbeats, and the weight of 2 lives in a box beside her. It wasn't the first time she'd carried something small and broken in that seat. But this time, maybe, just maybe, she could save it. The entrance to Blue Ridge Wildlife Haven looked more like a ranger station than a clinic. tucked deep in the trees off a winding mountain road. The modest wooden structure was ringed with tall wire enclosures, each one hidden partially by branches and tarps. No signs, no fanfare. Just a place that whispered, "Quiet work happens here." Ruth parked in the gravel lot, shut off the engine, and sat in the silence for a beat. Rain tapped lightly against the windshield. Cooper let out a soft huff in the back seat. "You ready?" she asked, not sure who she was talking to, him, herself, or the tiny creatures bundled in the cardboard box beside her. Inside, the air was warm and dry, smelling faintly of pine bedding and antiseptic. A woman with dark hair pulled back in a low braid appeared behind the front counter. She wore canvas pants, a navy windbreaker, and eyes that looked like they'd seen more than they said. "You must be Ruth." "I'm Amelia Hart." Ruth nodded, handing over the box with trembling hands. Amelia peeked inside, her face tightening as she scanned the kittens. "Let's not waste time." She led Ruth through a door and into a clinical room, already prepared. 2 other staff members were waiting, towels laid out, heat lamps humming softly above a stainless steel table. Ruth backed into the corner, Cooper at her heel, as Amelia moved with practiced calm. "First one's a female," she said, checking the smaller kitten. "Maybe 3 weeks old, heart slow, cold to the core." She moved to the second kitten. "This one's maybe 4 weeks. Slightly better condition. Still critical. Also female." They worked quickly. One staffer injected fluids beneath the kitten's skin. Another adjusted the heat source, layering towels so as not to overheat them. The room was filled with soft murmurs and rustling fabric. No panic, no dramatics, just urgency grounded in experience. Ruth watched in silence, her chest so tight she thought her ribs might splinter. "What happened out there?" Amelia finally asked, not looking up. "Found them in a ditch," Ruth said quietly. "After the storm. My dog, he wouldn't stop digging." Amelia nodded, still working. "Storm likely flooded their den. Mother may have tried to move them, or she didn't make it back." "Will they? Can they?" Ruth trailed off. Amelia glanced at her. "They've got a chance, a small one. First 48 hours are the hardest. Shock, infection, hypothermia. But they've got fight in them. That much I can feel." Ruth swallowed. The air felt too thick. Cooper let out a soft whine just once, and the larger kitten's ear twitched in response. Ruth stared. "Did she started. Amelia noticed too. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. Sometimes instinct remembers, even through mud and fear. Ruth lowered herself into the nearby chair, suddenly exhausted. She looked at her hands, mud-streaked, shaking. She remembered holding her daughter's hands in the hospital years ago, waiting for a different kind of miracle that hadn't come. Amelia spoke gently. "We'll take it from here. But I need your contact info. And I promise, we'll keep you posted." Ruth nodded. She didn't trust her voice. She stood, gave Cooper a gentle pat, then stepped close to the table. The kittens were nestled under the lamp now, blanketed in soft cloth, their tiny chests rising and falling like slow, careful tides. She didn't say goodbye, not out loud. Instead, she placed one hand near them, just hovering. A silent promise. Then turned and walked out into the cold mountain air. Cooper followed, glancing back just once, then falling into step beside her, like he always did. The sky was clearing overhead. Birds were starting to return, and Ruth, for the first time in years, felt the faintest stirring of hope begin to rise. The first night was the hardest. Ruth kept her phone on the kitchen counter, volume up, ringer loud. Every few hours she checked to see if she'd missed a call. She hadn't. Cooper lay near the back door, not asleep, just watching. At one point, around 2 in the morning, she found him sitting on the porch in the cold, ears perked toward the woods like he was listening for something only he could hear. She didn't call the center until just before noon the next day. Didn't want to seem impatient. But her voice cracked the moment Amelia answered. "Any news?" she asked, too quickly. Amelia was calm. They made it through the night. Still on fluids. Still under heat. The little one's having a tougher time, but she's fighting. We're cautiously hopeful. Ruth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees nearly gave way. Cautiously hopeful was more hope than she'd allowed herself. The days passed in fragments. Ruth took long walks with Cooper, but avoided the lower trail. She busied herself with chores she'd ignored all winter, cleaning the attic, trimming the orchard. But always her thoughts circled back, to the weight of the kittens in her arms, to the sound of Cooper's paws striking wet clay, to the question that had been with her since that morning. Why them? Why now? She called every day, sometimes twice. By day 4, the larger kitten, Cinder, they'd started calling her, was eating small amounts on her own. The smaller one, Ash, still needed tube feeding, still listless. Day 5 brought a turn. Amelia didn't sugarcoat it. Ash developed a respiratory infection overnight. We've started antibiotics. She's on oxygen support for now. Ruth sat down on the kitchen floor after that call and cried until Cooper curled up beside her, resting his chin on her leg. She whispered to him, "I can't lose her too." She hadn't said it out loud before. Not in years. Not since the snowstorm that took the road out. Not since the ambulance couldn't get through in time. Her daughter, June, had been 24. A slip on the ice, a fractured skull. Minutes made the difference. The blanket she'd wrapped the Bobcats in? June's. The scent still clung to it. Something warm, something left behind. Ruth had never planned on using it again. But maybe that's what grief did. It turned old objects into bridges. And now Ash lay beneath heat lamps, fighting for breath, tangled in Ruth's past in a way that made everything blur together. Loss and hope, memory and instinct. By day 7, Amelia's voice had changed. Still calm, but lighter. She sounded like someone who had good news and didn't want to jinx it. Ash responded to the meds. She's perkier today, still tiny, still behind. But she hissed at a tech who tried to move her. It's a great sign. Ruth laughed for the first time in days. Feisty little thing. Exactly what we want, Amelia said. Cinder had already started climbing in her enclosure. Ash tried too, but fumbled. They were separated for now to monitor their progress, but the staff planned to reunite them soon. Ruth asked if she could visit. Amelia hesitated. We limit contact, especially with predators. They need to stay wild. But I'll send photos. And once they're further along, maybe. That night, Ruth received 3 photos. One of Cinder perched on a padded shelf, eyes focused, coat gleaming. One of Ash curled tightly on a soft towel. One paw stretched outward, claws half unsheathed. And one of both kittens, noses pressed against a glass divider, as if waiting to be let into the same space again. Ruth printed them, taped them to her fridge. The storm had passed. The earth had settled. But something in her had been stirred loose. And in the quiet of her home, with Cooper stretched beside her and the photos watching silently from the kitchen, she allowed herself to believe in second chances again. It was the 11th day when Ruth's phone rang just after breakfast. She answered before the second ring. It's Amelia. I thought you'd want to hear this directly. Ruth braced herself. They're both stable, eating on their own, active, even Ash. Ruth pressed a hand to her chest. That's incredible. She's still behind, smaller than Cinder by a good bit. But she's catching up, and she's loud. She growls when we clean her enclosure, hisses at everyone. We love it. Ruth laughed, tears welling. She sounds like someone I used to know. They'll be reunited this afternoon, Amelia added. We'll monitor closely, but we expect it'll help. They remember each other. That afternoon, Amelia sent a short video. Cinder was already in the enclosure when a gloved hand gently set Ash down. For a moment, they both froze. Then, in a blink, Ash stumbled toward her sister, and the two tangled into one another, nuzzling, pawing, sniffing. No sound, no cry, just the silent certainty of recognition. Ruth watched the clip over and over. Cooper lay at her feet, eyes flicking toward the screen each time the bobcats moved. You remember, don't you? She said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. He blinked slowly, leaning into her hand. By the third week, the staff moved the kittens to what Amelia called the juvenile space, a larger indoor room with low platforms, hanging ropes, logs for climbing. The video updates showed the two of them wrestling, chasing, climbing, pouncing. Ruth watched them like a mother tracking her children at recess. Then came the conversation she wasn't prepared for. Amelia called on a quiet Thursday morning. The sky outside was heavy with the promise of spring rain. There's something we need to discuss, she said gently. Ruth stiffened. What is it? Ash is, well, she's attaching. Too much, not to everyone, just a few staff. She perks up when certain voices enter the room. We're worried she's starting to associate humans with safety. Ruth's throat went dry. What does that mean for her? If it continues, we may not be able to release her, at least not without risk. Bobcats can't think humans are safe. It puts them in danger. Silence settled between them. But there's time, Amelia added. We're rotating staff, limiting contact, using visual barriers, Cinder's remaining wild. If Ash follows her lead, we may course correct. Ruth hung up and didn't move for a long time. Her thoughts spun in circles, around what-ifs and maybes, around blame and guilt and longing. She'd only held them for that short drive, barely even spoken near them. But what if that had been enough? Cooper whined and nudged her knee. She looked down. Did we break her, Coop? He tilted his head. Or did we save her too well? The following week brought new photos, ones that filled her with cautious relief. Ash was climbing now, leaping from one branch to another, watching the staff warily from shadows, no longer pacing near the door when voices called. We think she's turning a corner, Amelia told her. Cinder's been a good influence. It's funny. Ash is bolder, first to try new things, but Cinder's the one keeping her wild. Ruth found that oddly comforting, that even wild things needed anchors, that boldness didn't mean recklessness, that perhaps, in nature as in life, healing came in pairs. She took another walk that afternoon, up the ridge this time, where the view stretched out over the valley like painted silence. Cooper stayed close, his steps light and quiet. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Ruth imagined two small shapes racing through the brush, darting, hiding, wild and alive. She didn't know how the story would end, but for the first time in a long while, she believed it still had somewhere to go. The cold edge of winter softened as April rolled in, and with it came new rhythms at the haven. Ruth received shorter updates now, just a line or two every few days. No emergencies, no backslides. just quiet progress. Amelia's latest message had been simple. They're thriving. Ash caught her first live mouse this morning. Cinder's hunting too. We're moving them to the outdoor enclosure next week. Ruth reread the message 3 times before setting her phone down. She didn't reply right away. There were no words that fit what she felt. Outside, birdsong returned in bursts, and the red buds along her fence had begun to bloom. The mornings were warmer, the air full of that damp, loamy smell that promised life beneath the soil. She and Cooper returned to the lower trail for the first time since the rescue. The ditch was dry now, grass growing over the edges. No sign remained of the place where everything had changed. Cooper paused near the bend. His tail was still. His ears twitched. Ruth stepped beside him, hand resting on his back. "I still see it too," she whispered. That night, Amelia called. There was something different in her tone. "How'd you feel about a visit?" she asked. "Just a short one, from outside the fence. No contact, no voices. But we think it's time." Ruth blinked. "Really? They're wild, fully. No human approach, no vocal response. But we think they'll recognize you, at least Cooper." 3 days later, Ruth drove up the mountain road again. Cooper riding shotgun in the passenger seat this time. He wore his weathered leather collar, the tag still unreadable from the storm-stained mud. Blue Ridge Wildlife Haven looked the same. Quiet, unassuming, sacred. Amelia met them at the gate, her smile small but warm. "They're in the far enclosure," she said, guiding them past rows of mesh fencing and thickets of pine. No sudden moves. No calling out. Just observe. The enclosure was a carefully constructed piece of forest, complete with rocks, native brush, a shallow stream. Ruth stood just outside the wire, heart pounding, eyes scanning the shadows. And then, movement. A flick of a tail. Cinder appeared first, sleek and muscular, her coat a tapestry of spots and amber light. She moved with the grace of something born in the wild. Ash followed, slightly smaller, but just as confident. Her eyes, bright and unblinking, scanned the tree line. Then slowly, both cats turned. Cooper hadn't moved. He stood at Ruth's side, ears forward, silent. Ash froze. There was no noise, no bark, no mule. But in that long, unmoving second, Ruth felt it. Something passing between them. Recognition without understanding. A thread stretched across weeks and distance and species. Cinder hung back, watching. Ash stepped forward, slow and measured, until she was a few feet from the fence. She sniffed the air, tail swaying. Then, almost imperceptibly, she blinked. Once. Slowly. Cooper returned the gesture. The moment passed. Ash turned, bounding up onto a fallen log. Cinder followed, and together they vanished into the brush, absorbed by the world that was now theirs. Ruth felt tears on her cheeks. Not heavy, just enough. "They're ready," Amelia said quietly. Ruth nodded. "They were never really ours, were they?" "No," Amelia said. "But for a while, they needed you." The 3 of them stood there, woman, dog, and healer, watching the space where the bobcats had disappeared. In the distance, a hawk cried. The wind shifted through the trees, and Ruth, for the first time since that muddy morning, felt something settle inside her. Not an ending, just a quiet, necessary letting go. The day of the release came with a soft sunrise, the kind that didn't announce itself with color, but crept in slowly, warming the tips of the trees and brushing the fields in pale gold. Ruth woke early. She hadn't planned to. No alarm, no message from Amelia. But her body stirred like it knew something sacred was about to happen. Cooper was already sitting by the door when she came downstairs, eyes steady, tail unmoving. "You feel it too, huh?" she said, rubbing his head gently. They didn't drive to the Haven. Ruth knew this part wasn't meant for her. Amelia had explained it during their last call. "We'll take them deep into the Pisgah boundary. Soft release. Temporary enclosure first, then we gradually open it. Let them decide when to go." "Will you tell me how it goes?" Ruth had asked. "Of course." Still that morning something pulled at her, not to see it, but to witness it in her own way. She walked the trail behind her house, the same one she and Cooper had walked 100 times, the one where everything had started. The ditch was just a ditch now, overgrown, soft with moss. But to her, it would always carry the weight of that moment. Mud flying, breath held, hope rising from the earth. Cooper moved ahead, then stopped. At the edge of the ditch, he sat down, head tilted slightly, and waited. Ruth joined him, said nothing. Time passed differently there. The sun rose higher. A hawk circled overhead. Somewhere in the trees, a fox squirrel chattered. Then Cooper stood. He didn't bark. He didn't move forward. He just looked. And Ruth followed his gaze. On the ridge beyond the ditch, barely visible between the trees, stood two shapes. Low to the ground, alert, watching. Cinder's frame was unmistakable. Taller now, powerful. Ash beside her, smaller but braver, as always. They didn't come closer. They didn't need to. Ash took one step forward, her eyes locked with Cooper's. Then she sat. Ruth's breath caught. A gesture so simple, so wild, and yet so familiar. They stayed like that for a while. Two creatures that shared a silent history. No leash, no command, just memory. Then Ash rose, turned, and vanished into the woods. Cinder followed, silent as breath. Cooper remained still. Ruth placed a hand on his back. "They made it," she whispered. He leaned into her. Later that day, Amelia would call with the official word. "They're gone. The enclosure's empty." We watched from a distance. They didn't hesitate. But Ruth already knew, because some goodbyes don't need words. They only need presence, a shared breath, a quiet vigil, and a final, unspoken promise that what was once broken had found its way back to the wild. Spring settled into the hills like a song remembered. The air turned warmer, softer. Wildflowers erupted in colors that had been hiding all winter. Ruth found herself walking more, not because she had to, but because the quiet had begun to feel like company. She still visited the ditch. Not every day, but often enough that Cooper would slow down when they neared it, glancing at her as if to ask, "Again?" "Just a minute," she'd say, kneeling in the grass. There was no trace of that muddy morning anymore. No paw prints, no broken earth, but she could still see it, as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Cooper digging, frantic and precise. The first glimpse of matted fur, the weight of tiny lives in her hands. Sometimes she imagined Ash and Cinder out there, hidden beneath ferns, leaping through creeks, stalking shadows with wild purpose. She didn't picture them looking back. That wasn't their story. And that, she'd come to understand, was the point. The flannel blanket stayed folded on the back of her couch. She couldn't bring herself to wash it. The scent of lavender had faded, but something else lingered. Something she couldn't name. A tether, maybe. A thread between past and present. One morning, Weeks after the release, a small envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, just the familiar logo of the Haven. Inside were 2 photos. One showed Ash perched on a rocky outcrop, eyes narrowed at something just beyond the frame. Fierce, independent. The second showed Cinder mid-pounce, blurred in motion, tail flared, alive in every sense of the word. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Ruth placed the photos beside the others on her fridge. She stood there a long while, smiling, a hand resting lightly on the door. "You did good, Coop," she said softly. He blinked up at her, tail thumping once. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Ruth stepped onto the porch with her coffee. Cooper curled beside her feet. The sky was streaked with amber and rose, the kind of colors that made the world feel forgiving. In the distance, a hawk cried. A breeze carried the scent of pine and rain, and something wilder still. She closed her eyes, not to forget, but to remember differently. She thought of June, of the ache that never fully left but softened, somehow, in the presence of new beginnings. She thought of Ash and Cinder, running free, of Amelia and the quiet army of hands that healed, of Cooper, who had sensed what no one else could, and of herself, not as a woman broken by loss, but as someone who, when called, had answered. "Let's go in, boy," she said at last, standing slowly. They turned toward the door together, woman and dog, stepping into the quiet with the kind of peace that only comes after the storm has passed. Not every story ends with fireworks. Some just end with 2 small miracles, gone without a sound, leaving behind the echo of something sacred. And that, Ruth thought, was more than enough.